Tucker, President of the International Academy of Trial Lawyers, and welcome to the Academy's official podcast, The Rule of Law, The Academy Speaks. Today, we've landed another big fish. We have Emily Bazelon here with us today. Emily is a staff writer with the New York Times. She's a lecturer at Yale University, and Emily has her own podcast, which, if you're like me, you have to listen to. And it's called Political Gabfest. It is the place to find out what's going on in politics, and I listen to it often, all the time. Emily, first, thanks for being here, and how are you?
I'm good. Thanks so much for having me. It's a pleasure.
Yeah, there's so much we can talk about, but let's talk about what's going on in America right now. And I want to particularly talk about what's going on in higher ed and some of the battles, which I'll call it, that's happening between Harvard and Columbia and the Trump administration. How do you see that's going on? Could you talk to us about that?
I think with Harvard and Columbia, you see a really contrasting set of responses from pressure from the Trump administration. So the Trump administration, as I'm sure many of your listeners know, has canceled hundreds of millions of dollars in federal funding to Columbia and billions of dollars worth of funding to Harvard. And especially in the case of Harvard, has really gone much further and is pulling out all kinds of stops in terms of investigating the university and kind of threatening not just money, but the loss of its the loss of its tax-free status. And the universities have made really different decisions about what to do. The Columbia decision has been, I think, to try to placate, so far unsuccessfully. It has not resulted in any resumption of funding to Columbia, but much more to say to the administration, we agree with some of these criticisms and we're going to do some of the things you're asking. And Harvard said no. In some ways, I think this is because the administration's demands of Harvard were just so over the top. They were really impossible for any university to say yes to. It was almost like a takeover of the education function of the university, taking away discretion over how people are educated at Harvard. And the demands at Columbia were more specific. And in some ways, I think that Harvard just decided that they were wanted to make sure to really maintain their independence and integrity, and they just were not going to be bullied. And they've won in court so far. So that's sort of where we are with those different examples.
What does that say that the administration is going after these schools? And I think one of the points you talked about was that they had gone just too far with Harvard. What should we as citizens be concerned about with the administration doing that?
I think there is a real imposition here of the government's idea of how a university should operate and the kind of education students should receive. Um, and the idea that the government is going to dictate that to a private university is really not how American education has functioned. And, also if you're someone who has any kind of libertarian streak and wants to make sure that private institutions in the United States, that our kind of civil society is not controlled by the government, it's pretty troubling to see the government come in and try to dictate these terms to Harvard, hiring, admissions, beyond the scope of what is legally required by, for example, the decision about affirmative action last year by the Supreme Court, right? We're sort of in a realm now of trying to, end any kind of diversity initiative. And I think really to go beyond that, to challenge the kind of liberal arts fabric of the university. What's underlying this, and this is clear from interviews that, conservatives in the administration and outside have given, is that a lot of people in the Trump administration think that universities have become kind of wrong-headed places, and they just don't agree with the generally liberal tenor of what a lot of the university does. Like,
Yeah,
right?
I was on a Katie Kirsch podcast and actually said it seems as though we have become anti-intellectual with our administration.
Right. And this is a little bit complicated, right? Because It is true that there are not very many conservative faculty members at a lot of top universities, and also that the student body, it's not, I think, kind of in an ideological straitjacket, but there could be more conservative representation, points of view. I think that's a legitimate critique. But that is very different from saying the government gets to come in and dictate the hiring terms and tell Harvard, to pursue basically affirmative action for conservatives in terms of hiring and admissions, right? There's a difference between saying, we see a problem here, and we, the government, are going to tell you, this private school, exactly how to fix it. And then there's just an issue of disproportionality, right? I mean, part of the rationale and maybe excuse for the administration's actions is this idea that there was anti-Semitic protest and activity at Harvard and Columbia. There's a complicated set of questions about anti-Semitism versus anti-Zionism. And then there's also just, okay, well, so maybe some things went wrong, but does that mean that you cancel $3 billion worth of funding that is mostly going to science and medicine? It has really very little to do with the part of the campus that you're concerned about.
I want to interrupt you there for a second because one of the senators who was on the side of the president and the withholding of funds said there are other institutions in the country who can do the same research that Harvard's doing. And the point, and I'm playing devil's advocate now, the administration is saying, you can do whatever you want to do, Harvard or Columbia, but if you want federal dollars, you're going to do it our way. Is that fair?
Well, I think, first of all, maybe eventually other universities, including public universities, could take over a lot of this research, but not immediately. I mean, there is absolutely going to be a loss in terms of scientific advancement because you have this incredibly abrupt canceling of so much money, right? These are labs that are in the midst of investigating, how we treat cancer and Alzheimer's and a million other things. And it's lovely to say that other universities can take that over, but that's not going to be some seamless or fast set of decisions. I just, would really, that just doesn't seem realistic.
I want to go a little bit since we brought up science. It seems as though, in addition to this administration being anti-intellectual, it's anti-science with what doing to the CDC. Help our listeners tease through what the hell is going on, Emily.
Right. I mean, this is confusing because, at least to me, because Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who's the Secretary of Health and Human Services and oversees the CDC, is making all these decisions. He has just dismissed this entire vaccine advisory committee, which sets the schedules, decides which vaccines will be recommended, which really importantly determines which will be free and covered by insurance for kids all over the country. And, he has been very clear vaccine skeptic for many years, going around with, the debunked theory that vaccines have caused autism, which there has
Hold
been.
on, let's stop and say that one more time. There is no scientific evidence that vaccines cause autism. As a matter of fact, the original author of that debunked article in England went to jail for starting that bullshit.
Yeah, I'm glad you said that. And also there is a mountain of evidence that they don't cause autism, right? It's not like it's some unstudied question, although RFK Jr. is now opening it up to review one more time by vaccine skeptics, which is in itself alarming. The thing I find confusing about this is the politics of it. President Trump did not run on an anti-vax platform. He has flirted with questioning vaccines, but it's not like he said, if you elect me, the head of HHS is going to be RFK Jr. and we're going to call into question American herd immunity and, free access to vaccines for kids. Like that just was not something that ever came up. So it seems like one of the kind of side effects of a Trump's election, as opposed to something that voters clearly knew that they were getting.
Well, I think the side effects, we've dealt with two of them. We've dealt with the anti-science and the anti-Harvard Columbia under the guise of trying to eradicate these schools of being anti-Semitic. Where is this coming from in the administration? You live this every day. Help me and the listeners understand where is this coming from? Because as you said, he didn't run on this. My eggs were supposed to be cheaper on day one. The stock market was supposed to be great. We were going to make America great again. We were going to do 90 deals in 90 days. All of these things, were promised to us. He was going to lower taxes. We were where is this nutsy thing coming from? And I said nutsy, not Nazi. Where's this nutsy thing coming from with him going after the vaccines and him going after the Columbias and the Harvards? What wing is that happening from?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think that Trump's movement, the MAGA movement, has different strands in it. One of them prominently was Project 2025, which, the very conservative Heritage Foundation put together. And some of the seeds for what we're talking about are very much present in Project 2025. And I think that it always, when you have someone like Trump elected, who really is a kind of chaos agent, it's not clear what is actually going to get implemented. And I think some voters, and you saw this in a lot of interviews around the election, they chose to believe the parts of Trump's platform, which you were just outlining, the price of eggs, immigration enforcement, these things that were very popular that he was talking about. And what is actually happening is that some of the less popular and less fully fleshed out elements of his agenda are actually becoming enormously important. And we've been talking about a couple of them. But I don't think if you'd asked a lot of voters, certainly I would not have been able to predict, oh, we're going to have, this level of vaccine skepticism at the Department of Health and Human Services, or that you were going to have billions of dollars of canceled funding for universities. It's not a surprise that Trump is a critic of universities, but the magnitude of it is pretty astonishing.
Well, I'm going to ask you a crazy question. What's keeping you busy at the Times lately?
Well, I cover legal issues, and as you very much know, there's just been a ton of action on that front. A record number of requests for emergency relief from government actions because there have been so many executive orders and because many of them have been quite aggressive. And I think the challenge for me is to figure out what's really important versus what's like right in front of me in the moment. That's always a challenge for journalists, right? Because we're writing only the first draft, and the faster we have to work, the more our noses are kind of pressed up against the glass, even as we're trying to describe what's happening around us. And so, um, when you have such a heavy volume of court cases and legal action, from my point of view, trying to decide, what really matters, what is going to shape the future of American law can be tricky. And this is also in another kind of current of this is the Supreme Court term, which has certainly been affected by all these requests for emergency relief because that has emerged on the court's emergency docket. And then there also are the regular merits cases, and we're almost to the end of the term. And so we're also waiting for a bunch of big decisions in that realm as well.
I have so many questions. Can you stick with me a little while longer? Uh, where do I want to begin? With the Supreme Court, what has surprised you with some of the recent, if anything, has surprised you with some of the recent rulings? Because I know from reading the Times and reading other, the Atlantic and other articles, the Wall Street Journal, some of the justices have not voted, and I'll put this in air quotes, according to script. Who has surprised you and what has surprised you?
Well, I think one significant surprise has been Justice Amy Coney Barrett's approach to executive power. In
Mhm.
a lot of ways, obviously Barrett is a Trump appointee, and she is on board for much of the conservative agenda, right? I mean, she voted to overturn Roe versus Wade. But she does seem to have hesitation about handing the presidency and this president as much power as the other conservative justices. So, for example, last summer in the immunity ruling, which gave presidents very broad immunity from criminal prosecution while they're in office, well, for actions they take in
Yeah.
office. should say. Justice Barrett wrote a concurrence, which really is much narrower than what the majority agreed to. And I think that's significant. But, she was the sixth vote, not the fifth vote in that case. So it didn't really affect the outcome.
Yeah. What has been your perspective on Justice Kavanaugh in these recent executive orders and the uh, holding Trump's feet, as I like to say, to the rule of law fire?
Yeah, I don't think Justice Kavanaugh is really interested in limiting executive authority very much.
Mhm.
He is a former White House lawyer, which is true also about Justice Alito and Chief Justice Roberts. And I think that informs his perspective on these questions. He's kind of seeing some of these cases from the point of view of the executive. One opinion or one recent ruling that is significant and is in the same domain is the ruling that the court made on its emergency docket about saying that Trump has the power to fire agency heads. This specifically was
Mhm.
about an appointee to the National Labor Relations Board and to the Merit Board that oversees federal employees. And in some ways, that was like quite a major ruling because for 90 years, there's been a precedent on the books from the Supreme Court, Humphrey's executor, which suggested that the president did not have the power that the court just said that it does. The court didn't expressly overrule that precedent, but suggested it was like on very shaky ground. And what I think is significant about this is that, Congress established a whole bunch of agencies in Washington with the understanding that those heads, those appointees could not be just willy-nilly fired by the president, that there had to be some kind of cause, some malfeasance or negligence.
Like an FBI director, say, for example.
Exactly. Exactly. And, this case, the court made a big exception for the Federal Reserve, which is important, given its really important responsibilities and the way in which the markets depend on its independence from the whims of the president. But it was also kind of a giveaway. Like, if there's going to be this exception for the Fed, which I think a lot of law professors thought that they didn't adequately justify, then why do we need to change this whole structural element of how the administrative agencies work in Washington?
All right, let me get the third thing, my third question on the Supreme Court before we jump. As we sit here in June of 2025, how do you think history, if we were to stop right now, will look at the Roberts Court and what has happened and what is with the Trump administration?
That's a great question. I mean, I think right now it looks like the Roberts Court has really given the presidency and this president a lot of unbounded power that it didn't have before. And it may be that the Trump administration is actually overreading the immunity decision from last summer because they cite it all over the place and have kind of taken it as this like carte blanche. Um, and maybe the court will pull back on that in some of these future cases, but that hasn't happened yet. And so, if you're asking me right now, we're looking at a court that has really, I think, allowed the executive to arrogate a lot of power to itself. I will add one caveat, which is I think the court has been standing up for some very fundamental right to due process in a set of cases involving these deportations. But honestly, it is so basic what they're saying. You can't snatch someone up off the streets and send them off to a prison in another country without proving anything about them, that it's almost like they're just sort of saying, okay, yes, we are still a court,
And
right? But
that to me is almost, and I guess as lawyers, or being trained as lawyers, I find that laughable that we are in 2025 discussing due process. I had almost forgotten the use of the term due process because it's so baked into the cake of everything that we do that for the
exactly.
Supreme Court to be addressing due process in 2025, one of the most well-settled areas of the law, I find that concerning.
Well, and I think an underlying dynamic here is that the Trump administration does all kinds of things, right? They throw spaghetti at the wall, and that has certainly been true about their approach to the rule of law. And so then you end up feeling like the Supreme Court is standing up for something important, but in a sense, the picture is so distorted that maybe you shouldn't even be having, maybe they shouldn't even have to answer that question, right?
I analogize it to a doctor saying that cigarette smoking causes cancer. It's like, yeah, we've known that forever. And to
Right. And
say,
if you said otherwise, we would like really be in the soup, but we could
yes,
still be in the soup anyway.
yeah. Well, what's concerning you with what's going on at the Supreme Court, if anything?
I think that the questions that have been asked in the last year and a half about, the ethics of Justice Clarence Thomas and secondarily Justice Alito, I think those are legitimate questions to ask about the appearance of impartiality, whether those justices have really traversed those boundaries. They're not changing their behavior or, recusing themselves from cases as a result. But I think those are still outstanding questions about the kind of integrity of the court as a whole because the court hasn't addressed those issues. And then I think there's just this question that is about forces outside the court. That's another unresolved issue we have looming, which is about judicial review and judicial independence. When you have an executive that is seems to be willing to defy court orders, how far is this going to go? And if it really comes to the question of, whether Trump might defy a Supreme Court order, what will the justices do? Are they going to basically try to duck so that they don't end up in that kind of clash with the executive? These are not questions that you want to be asking in a healthy democracy.
Yeah. Emily, I always end my podcast by asking folks, despite everything that's going on now, and we can describe it as legal chaos, what gives you hope?
Well, I think there's been a lot of political involvement, right? I hope that people are paying attention. My job is to get people to think, and to pay attention. And so, while I don't want to suggest that one kind of response is better than another, because that's not my role as a journalist, I think that engagement is important right now. That if you're ignoring what's happening and kind of letting yourself off the hook of caring about it, that is its own kind of threat. So the fact that when I talk to people, they seem to know about what's going on and have opinions about it, like that's promising because we're going to have more elections, I hope.
Emily, thank you for being here today. I hope my listeners got to understand why I listen so much to your podcast. It is, at least from my perspective, and I'll say I'm biased, it's the best podcast out there.
Oh, well, thank
I,
you.
I,
That's
I
a
am
lovely
a,
recommendation.
I am an avid listener. To everyone, I want to thank you for listening to The Rule of Law, The Academy Speaks, and my guest has been Emily Bazelon. My name is Joe Tucker, and you can catch this podcast and all our other podcasts wherever you get your favorite podcasts on Spotify, iTunes. Listen in. Take care. See you next week.